I want you to close your eyes for a second. We're going to step out of a time machine.
Always a dangerous request.
Right, but trust me on this one. The year is 1912. The location is Berlin. But I want you to forget those gray, grim, jerky newsreels you usually see from this era.
Oh, yeah, those make it look so sterile.
Exactly. This is a city that is absolutely vibrating. The cafes are loud, the electric trams are screeching, and there is this feeling, this buzz, that the world is just tilting on its axis.
It was a very charged time.
Very. And you step off the street into this darkened room. It smells like stale tobacco and ozone. A projector whirs to life, much louder than you'd expect, and a beam of flickering light cuts through the smoke. You aren't just watching a movie. You are watching the birth of an entire industry.
It's a great image to start with, because we tend to look back at cinema history as this smooth, inevitable progression. First the camera, then the silent movie, then sound. But the early teens in Germany, that was the Wild West, or maybe more accurately, a gold rush. It was chaotic, it was experimental, and incredibly competitive.
And we aren't trying to map the whole gold rush today. That's just way too broad. We are grabbing our pickaxes and zooming in on one specific prospector. Today, we're doing a deep dive into a company called Eiko Film.
Eiko Film.
Now, I know what you're thinking out there. Eiko isn't exactly Disney or Paramount.
Far from it.
But that is exactly why we picked this stack of sources for today's deep dive. Sometimes looking at the giants doesn't tell you the real story.
No, it really doesn't.
It's the mid-sized players, the ones that scrambled and fought and eventually disappeared, that show you how the machine actually worked.
Eiko Film really is the perfect case study for that. If you follow their timeline, which we're going to do, you see the rapid construction of the German cinema infrastructure.
Yeah.
You see the strange, paradoxical economic benefits of World War I.
Which is fascinating.
It really is. And you see the absolutely ruthless nature of the early film business. It's a story about how isolationism can accidentally build an empire.
So just to give you an overview of what we're working with, we've got a really interesting stack of historical records here. We've got everything from the company's founding documents to architectural notes on their studios and this amazing detailed list of their film releases between 1914 and 1922.
And that filmography is essentially a mood ring for the German people during the most turbulent decade of the 20th century.
A mood ring. I love that.
Yeah, you can literally see the national psyche cracking and reforming just by reading the movie titles.
Okay, before we get to the movies, though, we have to build the stage. The story starts in 1912 with a producer named Franz Vogel.
Vogel's an interesting character. He establishes Eiko Film right as the demand for feature-length content is just exploding. Yeah, and it doesn't waste any time. The records describe Eiko as swiftly becoming one of Germany's, quote, more important companies.
That word swiftly really jumps out at me. It implies there was a massive vacuum just waiting to be filled. They didn't struggle in a garage for a decade. They launched and hit the ground running.
Well, the market was hungry. But to feed that market, you needed physical space. And this is where the logistics of 1912 get super interesting. Eiko didn't start with their own massive backlot. Initially, they were just renting space at the Rex Film Studios in Berlin.
Which feels like a classic startup move. You lease the co-working space until you can afford to build the headquarters.
Precisely. But Vogel had ambitions. He didn't want to be a tenant forever. So they eventually moved to construct their own facility in the suburb of Marienfelde. They built the Marienfelde Studios.
Now, I want to spend a minute on this because the description of the studio is wild compared to what we have today. The source calls it a glasshouse studio. The glasshouse.
It's such an evocative term.
It really is. Because when I hear the word studio today, I think of a soundstage. A big, concrete, windowless bunker with massive air conditioning units and millions of dollars of LED lighting rigs. But a glasshouse studio, that's basically a greenhouse, isn't it?
Effectively, yes. Literally a greenhouse. You have to remember the technological bottleneck of the time. Film stock in 1912, mostly orthochromatic stock, was incredibly slow.
I mean, it needed a lot of light.
A massive amount of light just to register an image.
And electric lights were what? Were they just too weak back then?
They were expensive, they were hot, and the light was incredibly harsh. You had carbon arc lamps, but they sputtered and hissed and threw off awful fumes. The only light source, powerful enough and cheap enough to light a wide shot, was the sun.
So you just build your factory out of glass?
Exactly. Walls of glass, roof of glass. You were basically trapping daylight.
Which sounds beautiful visually, like this crystal cathedral of light. But I'm imagining the physical reality of working inside a giant glass box in July in Berlin.
Oh, it must have been a total nightmare. Think about the actors. They're in heavy period costumes, wool suits, layers of petticoats.
Oh, wow.
And they're wearing thick grease paint makeup because that early film stock washed out their facial features. And now they're standing in a sealed greenhouse in the middle of summer.
The makeup must have just been melting off their faces.
Constantly. Puddles of it. And it wasn't just the heat that was a problem. It was the consistency of the light. The sun, as we know, moves.
Right.
You start filming a scene at 10 in the morning, the shadows are on the left. By lunch, the shadows are directly overhead. By 3, they're on the right. If you're a director trying to cut a scene together later, that's a continuity disaster.
So how on earth did they manage that? You can't just tell the sun to stop moving.
No, but you can diffuse it. These glass houses were actually engineering marvels in their own way. They had these highly complex systems of muslin shades and diffusers hooked up to pulley systems.
Like giant blinds.
Exactly. Crews would spend the whole day scrambling around, adjusting these massive sheets of fabric to soften the light or block direct beams, just trying to keep the look somewhat consistent from shot to shot.
That really emphasizes that this was an industrial process. The source specifically notes that this glass house was part of Germany's growing film infrastructure, and that word infrastructure feels really heavy. They weren't just artists running around with hand-cranked cameras. They were pouring concrete and setting steel frames.
That's the key takeaway here. Eiko wasn't just making movies. They were building the physical capacity for an industry. They were taking a novelty craft and turning it into a factory system. And as it turns out, they finished building that factory just in time for the world to completely fall apart.
Right. 1914. The First World War begins. And this is where the story pivots from architecture into economics.
And it connects to the bigger geopolitical picture in a way people often forget.
Yeah.
Usually when we think of war in the arts, we think of destruction.
Yeah. Museums bombed, theaters closed down.
Right, funding being diverted to weapons and rations. And while there was certainly immense tragedy for a company like Eiko, the war actually provided a massive, albeit cynical, advantage.
The notes mention a very specific market condition. Foreign imports were largely excluded from the German market during the war.
Think about the massive implications of that. Before 1914, cinema was a heavily globalized trade. If you walked into a theater in Berlin in 1913, you were just as likely to see a French comedy from Pathé or a massive Italian historical epic as your domestic German film.
And suddenly, the borders just snap shut. The global supply chain is severed.
It's protectionism enforced by bayonet. No more French films, no more British films, eventually no American films. So if you are a German cinema owner and you have thousands of seats to fill every single night, where do you get your product?
You have to buy local. You literally have no other choice.
Exactly. So Eiko is sitting there in their brand new glass house in Marienfelde, and suddenly they're operating in a walled garden. They have a captive audience of millions who cannot buy the competitor's product.
It's a massive irony. The war, which is tearing Europe apart, is acting as a greenhouse, pardon the pun, for this specific domestic industry.
It's a dark irony, but a very consistent one in economic history. Isolationism forces domestic production to scale up incredibly fast. Germany had to make its own entertainment because it couldn't import it. This period, from roughly 1914 to 1918, is really what created the bedrock foundation for the massive German film industry of the 1920s.
That's fascinating.
We always talk about masterpieces like Metropolis and Nosferatu later on, but those films don't happen without companies like Eiko filling the void and building the technical skills and the audience habits during the war years.
So they have the studio, they have the market dominance. The obvious question is, what were they actually making inside that glass house?
This is where we get to play cultural psychologist.
Let's look at the selected filmography we have here from 1914 to 1922. It's fascinating because, like you said earlier, you can almost see them reacting to the newspaper headlines in real time.
Let's start right at the beginning of the conflict. 1914. The war begins in August. Patriotism is at an absolute fever pitch. Everyone thinks the troops will be marching home victorious by Christmas. And what does Eiko release? A film titled Bismarck.
Bismarck, as in Otto von Bismarck, the Iron Chancellor, the guy who literally unified Germany a few decades prior.
The ultimate unquestionable symbol of German strength, unity, and military prowess.
That is, well, it's not subtle. That's like an American studio releasing a movie called George Washington right after Pearl Harbor.
It's a total blockbuster move. It's perfect timing. They're capitalizing directly on that initial wave of nationalistic fervor. It's a very smart commercial play, but it also shows how quickly the film industry aligned itself with the state's narrative. The message is basically, here is where we came from, and here is why we are strong.
But then, look at the shift in the timeline. We fast forward to 1916 and 1917. The home by Christmas dream is completely dead. The reality is brutal trench warfare, naval blockades, and severe hunger on the home front. The initial excitement is long gone. And what is Eiko releasing now? We have a title here, His Coquettish Wife from 1916.
And The Unmarried Woman in 1917.
These sound like, they sound like rom-coms, or at least domestic farces.
They almost certainly were. His Coquettish Wife, that sounds like a very light, very frothy bedroom comedy.
And in the exact same year, 1917, they dropped The Adventures of Captain Hansen.
Which heavily implies high adventure, maybe some swashbuckling, exotic locations, bit of danger.
So we've gone from Bismarck, heavy, serious, patriotic history to flirting wives and seafaring adventure stories. That feels like a massive pivot for a studio.
But does it really? Think about the audience sitting in the dark. By 1917, the German public is exhausted. They're grieving lost sons and brothers. They're literally starving due to the blockades. Do they want to go to the cinema to see more war? Do they want to see serious political dramas about duty?
Definitely not. They want out.
Exactly. They want a window to a completely different world. They want to sit back and laugh at a husband getting tricked by his wife. They want to see Captain Hansen sailing the high seas, far, far away from the mud of the Western Front. It's pure, uncut escapism.
Escapism manufactured in a glass box. It really highlights that Eiko was a generalist studio. They weren't trying to be an elevated art house. They were a business, first and foremost. They looked at the public mood and said, okay, you want distractions, we will print distractions.
Which is a completely valid service during a severe crisis.
Then we move into 1918 and 1919. The war ends in November 1918. The German Empire essentially collapses. The Kaiser abdicates. It is absolute terrifying chaos on the streets of Berlin. And in 1918, Eiko releases a film called The Bracelet. And in 1919, a movie just titled Love.
Love, simple, elemental.
And The Girl and the Men, also in 1919. It really feels like the scope of the storytelling is shrinking rapidly. We aren't doing national heroes anymore. We aren't even doing high seas adventure. We are just looking at regular people.
The scale becomes deeply intimate. I think that reflects a society that is trying to figure out how to rebuild itself from the absolute ground up. The grand political narratives completely failed them. They led to utter ruin. So art retreats to the personal level. Questions like, how do men and women relate now? What does love even look like in a ruined city? These titles, The Bracelet, The Girl, and the Men, they sound like melodramas or tight chamber pieces. They are processing immense trauma on a micro-human level. Then we hit the post-war boom, 1920 to 1922. Inflation is starting to tick up. Politics are getting weird and radicalized. And Eiko gives us Wibbel the Tailor in 1920. Now, I actually looked this one up. Schneider-Wibbel is a pretty famous German play, isn't it? It is. It's a very classic regional folk comedy. The basic story is about a tailor who gets in trouble with the law, but he manages to swap places with his apprentice to avoid going to prison.
So it's a story about outsmarting authority.
Bingo. Think about that specific theme in the context of 1920 Germany. The old authority figures, the military generals, the aristocracy, the Kaiser, had just led the entire country off a cliff. There was a deep, very cynical distrust of authority across the board. So a comedy where a little guy, a simple tailor, makes a fool of the police and the courts, that would have played incredibly well to a bitter audience.
It's comfort food, sure, but with a real rebellious, anti-establishment edge.
Exactly. And then they follow that up with Sons of the Night in 1921, which sounds much darker, maybe dipping a toe into that gritty crime thriller genre that became so massive in the Weimar era later on.
And finally, we have The Inheritance in 1922.
The Inheritance.
That is just a painfully fitting title for their last listed film, considering what happens to the company next.
It really is. Because by 1922, the independent, high-flying run of Eiko Film hits a solid brick wall.
We mentioned earlier that the film business is ruthless. Eiko had a really good run, 10 years, surviving a world war, building a massive studio from scratch. But in 1922, they basically get eaten.
Acquired is the polite corporate term. The entire company and the Marienfelde Studios were taken over by Terra Film.
And Terra Film wasn't just another scrappy startup. They were becoming a legitimate giant.
Right. The 1920s saw a massive wave of consolidation in the industry. It wasn't enough to just be a successful, standalone studio anymore. You had to be a conglomerate. Smaller studios were getting bought up left and right to form these huge vertical monopolies. Eiko, despite its success, or honestly perhaps because of its success, became a very tasty asset for a much bigger fish.
But here is the plot twist in the business history that I absolutely love. The source clearly says that even after Terra Film bought them lock, stock, and barrel, the name Eiko didn't disappear.
Yeah, it didn't. But crucially, it didn't stay with Terra Film either.
Right. The notes specify that the name Eiko was used by productions released by a rival company, National Film, until much later in the decade.
This is such a fascinating, almost modern detail of corporate history. Think about what actually happened in that boardroom. Terra buys the physical assets. They want the glass house, the cameras, the lighting rigs, maybe the actor contracts. They want the physical means of production.
But they didn't care about the actual sticker on the door.
Apparently not. They had their own brand. But National Film, their rival, saw real value in the brand itself. The name Eiko meant something to the ticket-buying audience. It meant, hey, that's the company that gave us Wibbel the Tailor. It signified a certain level of quality or at least reliable entertainment. Yeah. So National Film somehow negotiates or ends up with the rights to the name, and they just keep slapping it on their own movies.
It's almost like a zombie brand.
Yes.
The body is totally gone. The original founding team, the studio ownership, the building, all gone. But the name just keeps walking around on movie posters.
It feels very 21st century, doesn't it? We see this all the time today, where a beloved electronics company goes bust. But 10 years later, you can still buy cheap TVs with their logo on it at the supermarket because some holding company bought the IP. It shows that by the 1920s, film wasn't just considered an art form. It was a highly sophisticated consumer goods industry. They understood that the brand was a commodity, completely separate from the factory that actually made the product.
It really drives home the idea that these weren't just bohemian artists in berets making art for art's sake. These were hardcore industrialists trading assets. The studio building is one asset, and the intellectual property of the name is another.
Absolutely. It shows a level of commercial maturity and ruthlessness that we don't always credit to that early silent era.
So let's just step back for a second and look at the whole arc we've covered here. We start in 1912 with Franz Vogel renting a room.
Betting everything he has on a brand new medium.
Right. They build this fragile glass palace in Marienfelde, battling the sun and the melting grease paint.
Betting heavily on physical infrastructure.
Then the war hits. It cuts them off from the rest of the world.
Yeah.
And instead of collapsing under the weight of it, they thrive because they own the local captive market.
The accidental empire built entirely on isolation.
And they churn out a filmography that perfectly tracks the emotional roller coaster of an entire nation. From the fierce pride of Bismarck, to the desperate escapism of coquettish wife, to the deep cynicism of Wibbel the Tailor.
A full decade of cultural therapy, basically, printed on celluloid.
And finally, they are carved up and sold off for parts in 1922, with their physical studio going to one giant and their good name going to another.
It's a complete perfect life cycle of a business.
You know, when you look at the bibliography for this deep dive, we see some really heavy hitters in cinema history. Books like The Ufa Story by Klaus Kreimeier and A Second Life, German cinema's first decades. In the grand sweeping scope of those massive books, Eiko is probably just mentioned on a few pages, right?
Oh, absolutely. In the broad history books, Eiko is what Wikipedia would call a stub. It's a footnote compared to the absolute behemoths like UFA that came along later and dominated the globe. But I really think dismissing them as just a footnote is a massive mistake.
Why is that? Why should you, the listener, care about the stub?
Because the massive German film industry that shocked the world in the mid-20s, the industry that gave us German expressionism, the industry that revolutionized camera movement and shadow work, that directly influenced Hollywood film noir, that didn't just appear by magic.
It wasn't a sudden lightning strike?
No, not at all. It was built directly on the infrastructure that companies like Eiko created through trial and error. Eiko built the glass houses. Eiko trained the lighting crews to deal with the sun. Eiko cultivated the audience habit of going to the movies every week during the war. They were the literal building blocks. You simply can't have the beautiful skyscraper without the concrete foundation, even if that foundation gets buried underground where nobody can see it.
It's the invisible history. Eiko is the shoulders that the giants eventually stood on.
Precisely. And they show us that film history isn't just about analyzing the masterpieces. It's about the daily, sweaty grind of business. It's about the weather, the shifting politics, and the sheer dumb luck of being in exactly the right place when the borders suddenly close.
You know, thinking about their filmography, particularly that stark shift from Bismarck to his coquettish wife, it actually leaves me with a question that I can't quite shake.
What's that?
If we looked at the movies released during a major crisis today, like right now in our modern era, what would they tell us? If a historian in 100 years looked at our collective filmography during a global pandemic or a massive recession or a modern conflict, would they see the story of the crisis itself? Or would they just see the story of our distraction from it?
Wow. That is a very uncomfortable question.
No.
Do we want a mirror held up to us, or do we just want a window to look out of? Eiko managed to give their audience both, depending on the specific year.
Yeah.
I really wonder which one we are overwhelmingly choosing today.
It's definitely something for you to mull over the next time you're endlessly scrolling through a streaming menu, trying to decide between a heavy documentary and a superhero movie. Thanks for taking this deep dive into the flickering black and white world of Eiko Film with us today.
It was a real pleasure.
Keep digging, and we'll see you on the next one.